Ben. So, my name's Ben, I teach at UCL, and the purpose of this session is to start from the assumption that since you're all at the beginning of the process, you won't really have honed the ideas for your research fully yet. So I'm working on the assumption that you've got some interests, but you need to actually turn them into academic research projects. So this is meant to be a practical half hour on how to go from a vague idea to something specific that looks like a research proposal. And basically I'm going to try and say two things. So it should be possible in 25 minutes, despite the fact that, like all lecturers, I love the sound of my own voice. And this is meant to be a workshop, so I will try and stop and get you to talk to each other a bit rather than just sit there like zombies. So the two things I want to say should be easy to remember because they're both based on metaphors. So we've got two metaphors, and the metaphors are based on my hobbies, which are food and drink. So the first one is the most important one, obviously, which is drink. So what we have here, and what I want you to take away as the first idea here, is this wine glass. This may look like a boring lecture slide, but it is in fact a wine glass. So you can start fantasizing at 10 o'clock in the morning about filling that up with whatever drink you like. And the point about wine glass, and what I'd like you to draw down or note down or take a joke, is just the shape. So if you're taking notes, the note I want you to take at this point is just a little wine glass shape. And the point about the shape is it goes from broad at the top to narrow in the middle, the stem of the glass, and then broad at the bottom. And in the tortured way that we use metaphors, one of the key points here that I want to make is that if it didn't have that broad base at the bottom, the wine glass would fall over and your wine would spill everywhere and be wasted. So what I'm trying to say is that this bit at the bottom, which is in a decade's experience of marking undergraduate dissertations, what often gets forgotten. So let me talk you through the wine glass. So obviously there's a kind of narrative, start at the top, we finish at the bottom. And then there are kind of sections. So if you think about the dissertation that you're going to write at the end of the process, or the report that you're going to write for the RGS at the end of the process, it'll have an introduction, it'll have a section talking about the research project, and it'll have some conclusions. So those are the three main sections of your dissertation. And if we look at the introduction first, the key point I'm trying to get across here is that you need to start with something really broad and big, so that you're actually talking about the big words that you hear in lectures like economy, like nature, culture, those monster topics, the topics that are kind of defining whole courses. So when you're kind of choosing your courses, you will choose an economic geography course or a development geography course. So that's the kind of the broad area your research is going to sit in. And because you do those courses, you'll know what the current interests of geographers and planners and development studies people, what their current interests in that broad area are. So you kind of start by saying, here's my dissertation. It's in development geography, and currently in development geography, these are the broad questions. And through that process, you can help to identify something a little bit more specific. And out of that process, you reach down to the point where it starts to get a bit narrower. So you go from broad, the top, down to something narrower, and then you get into the actual research you do. So you carry out some data collection, and then you analyze your data. And the final part of the exercise, and this is the crucial bit, is that you go back to your research questions. So you kind of make sure you actually answer the questions you set yourself, and you go back right to the top of the glass and say, so what does this all mean for economic geography? What does this all mean for development geography? So the key thing here is going from broad to narrow to broad. So here's a kind of quick worked example from some of my own research. We could think about a kind of sub-discipline of geography, urban geography. So the kind of top of the glass, urban infrastructure, urban geography, big debates about health, livability, economics. These are kind of these monstrously big terms. And within the field of urban geography, there's lots of questions again around urban governance. So you start getting into the jargon. And out of that, I need something a bit more specific that I can look at that's going to be of interest to me, because it's impossible for me to cover everything in urban governance. So I kind of start focusing in. And I'm interested in water supply. I've got a long-standing interest in water supply in African cities. And in particular, around this governance issue, how the private sector can get involved in urban water supply. And out of that, I get to the bit where I'm narrowing down the top of the stem, and I have my research question here. My research is concerned with finding out how the private sector is involved in financing water infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. So I've started very broad, and I've come down quite narrow. So I undertake my study, and I look at privatization in Cameroon, and I analyse my data. And then I come to the foot of the wine glass, the bit that props the whole thing up, make sure it's got some coherence. And we discovered that my results showed that all these new investments that should be there in theory have been delayed because the government's doing its best to obstruct privatisation in Cameroon. It doesn't want privatisation, so it does all its work to obstruct it. And because the international water companies don't want to go to Cameroon either. So we finally can reach the conclusion that the experiment with private sector participation has failed to generate new capital. So that can contribute to the broader debate. So it's all about broad, narrow, broad. And why? Why bother with this? The key thing here is that when we go out and do research, we all become fascinated with the specificities and the places that we care about and we get to know and the people who live there. In my case, small corners of Cameroon, but there's no reason why any of the rest of the people in the room should be particularly interested in those people or those places. So what I have to do is I have to show why, if you're a geographer with interest in Asia, or an urban geographer with interest in London or Sheffield, why you might be interested in my research. And what this wine glass model does is it forces you, as the author of the research, as the researcher, to explain to a broader audience why everybody in urban geography or everybody in development geography should read your dissertation, why you've got something to say about your little study in a corner of Cameroon that's actually of relevance to everybody who's doing development geography, because it makes this connection between that water privatisation story to big debates about health and livability and economics. The second advantage is that you can think about more practical, so this is a more pragmatic one, you can think about changing the shape of the wine glass. So, poor metaphor is getting stretched even further. So on the left we have a champagne flute. So congratulations, you've won the lottery and you've discovered a really great project with lots of really rich data. And when you've got really good data, you can spread out your bit of the study, the narrow bit, the specific bit. So you can fill out, you'll have a word limit. You've got your 10,000, 12,000 word limit for your dissertation. You can use up 8,000 of your words on your data and analysis because you've got really good data, because everything went really well, you were well planned, you got a nice study, everyone was cooperative, you've got lots of interviews, you've got lots of material to analyse, so you can expand that part of the study as long as you keep the top and the bottom there so that you've still got the connection to the broad debates. On the other hand, this student had a horrible time when they went out to collect their data and everybody obstructed them, everything went wrong, nobody helped them get interviews, so they've got a very small narrow section. But what they can do is they can expand the introduction so that they do a much more conceptual, theoretical piece. But it's still, even if you've only got a little bit of data, even if your data isn't great, you can make it work as a piece of research by still going through this point of connecting to the big debates, doing your little specific study with whatever you've got, and then coming back out to the big debates. So that's the good model. That's what we want. We all want wine glasses. The thing to avoid, and those of us who mark dissertations can spot these a sort of mile off, is the amorphous blob dissertation, the amorphous blob piece of research. So this often happens when somebody has a place first. So you don't start from the literature, you don't start from existing research, you don't start from subdisciplinary debates, you don't start from your lectures, you start because Uncle Bob has a job with Guinness in Douala. So you think, hey, it'd be great, I could go and spend the summer with Uncle Bob in Douala and the people at Guinness in Cameroon. Cameroon's interesting, that's kind of exotic and foreign and there must be development going on there, I'll go there. And so you go there and then you spend the first 2 weeks getting to know all the expats who hang around the pool in the kind of 5-star hotel, the one 5-star hotel in Douala. And then you kind of think, well, I better do a dissertation. What's going on around me? And you're kind of embedded in a certain narrow world and you can't, you just start madly trying to find out everything that's going on in Douala because you don't really have that intellectual focus that starts from an intellectual academic question and from intellectual academic debates. So you madly ask very specific research questions about what's happening in the place you are. You find out everything you possibly can about those. You do some analysis on that data, and you answer those specific research questions. And this is a problem because it tends to raise dull questions. There's something that you've probably all had in your feedback, which is this kind of mysterious distinction that all your lecturers are obsessed with, which is the difference between description and analysis. So you get feedback where your lecturer will say, this essay is too descriptive, this project is too descriptive, it's insufficiently analytical, there's no critical analysis here. And amorphous blobs tend to lead to very descriptive dissertations. You describe a lot about what's happening in Douala and what you've seen through your eyes, because you're not starting with a clear set of questions. You tend to tell just a narrative account. Second, you don't have that ability to go back and say, this is what my study contributes to development geography. This is what my study contributes to urban geography or economic geography. You don't have that built-in connection to the big questions of the sub-disciplines. So other geographers in the corridor will say, well, who cares? I mean, why are we bothered about what you've discovered this summer? So what? The so what question should always hang in the air when you're doing your planning, kind of thinking about, can I answer the so what question? When somebody who's not interested in my particular corner of the world asks me, so what? Why does your dissertation matter? Why is it interesting? You can say, well, you may be interested in Sheffield and planning, but I can tell you that actually it's the same water company and the same issues that are kind of involved in the planning of water supply and the funding of water supply in the cities of the global south. And let me give you an example from Cameroon. So you can kind of make the connections that we have a story about water privatization here and a story about water privatization there, and they're different, they've got commonalities, and you're kind of embedded in a conversation in which people can see, even if they don't care about Cameroon or Africa, they can see why this is a good piece of research. And then the third pragmatic reason is that if you do have a disaster and you get to Uncle Bob's in Douala and you're sitting there and then everybody gets in your way and tries to obstruct your getting research, they say you haven't got a research permit, you can't go around asking these questions or something like that, and you don't come back with any data, then you're in real trouble if you've gone down the amorphous blob route. So go for the wine glass and not for the amorphous blob. So a few quick caveats on the end of this first point. First, don't feel, and Glyn's already kind of hinted at this, don't feel that just because you're working in developing areas, it has to be policy relevant, it has to be about the global, it has to be about development. There are lots of projects in Africa, Asia, Latin America that can be about culture, music, dance. We've had some great dissertations over the years that I've seen around questions that relate to politics and music. It can be quite arts, humanities type research. Lots too that can be historical. There's some really interesting underexplored archives in the global south. So if you've got interest in archival work, historical work, you can do that. So don't feel that development dissertations have to be policy relevant. And then second, I don't want to kind of lay this down, the wine glass down as a prescription. You've got the right to be flexible. You've got the right to change your questions. Part of the problem of the wine glass is that it kind of feels like a set of tram tracks that you're kind of expected to follow. So there's plenty of people who would say that it's really good to be open to the unexpected, that there might be other questions that you discover when you're in the field that kind of expand your project, and you should be ready to do that. So don't feel you have to ignore what's interesting because you've got blinkers on. You said, I've planned the project this way, I must stick to it. So feel free to adapt and change for projects to evolve while you're in the field. And then finally, some of my colleagues would actually object to the wine glass on what it says about the relationship between the particular and the general. So some people would say that you ought to be very cautious about making these connections, and that you ought to be careful about saying that your study in a particular place can be generalized. So those are just caveats around the wine glass. So that's the first point. That's the kind of the drink-related metaphor. The other one is a food-related metaphor. So this is a recipe, and this is how I'm going to use the rest of my time for this session. This is obviously a recipe to make a dissertation, but you start off with a set of ingredients, and you're going to turn it into a wonderful piece of patisserie that Raymond Blanc would be proud of. So this is a kind of just a set of tips to follow. And this is where I'm saying you might have a set of ideas that you're interested in at the moment. You've discovered that you care about the HIV/AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa or something. And now you want to know, how do I go from that interest into actually doing some research on that interest? How do I take that general interest and turn it into a particular, specific, proper project? And that's what these 5 steps are designed to do. So you'll all be at different points in this process. So you might want to kind of say, well, I've already done point 1 and I'm on point 2 or even further through. So position yourself within this sequence. And I'll take you through this step by step with some worked examples, with some case studies from my own work to show you what I mean. So let me talk first about my terms and define my terms. So when I say an interest, I'm meaning the broad academic area of inquiry your work is based in. When I talk about a broad topic, it's going to be a phrase where if your granny asked you what's your dissertation about, you would probably reply with your broad topic. So it'd be nice, clear terms, not too jargony. And it would kind of summon up something that people can understand quite quickly. And then the narrow topic is where it starts getting jargony and academic and social sciencey sounding, where you've introduced some parameters to your study and implied a claim that can be tested. So don't worry about those, I'll come back to those, but those are the 3 ingredients, if you like. Those are the 3 main ingredients for this recipe. So how do you identify an interest? So if you're really floundering, so if you're out there going, I'd love to do a development-based dissertation, but I have no idea where to start. How do you start finding your interests? So how do you know what interests you? Go on.
Well, you know if you're interested in something when you work towards it, it doesn't seem like effort.
Exactly, yeah, great one, yeah. So that thing where you're reading a paper or you're writing for an essay and suddenly you look at your watch and it's 2 in the morning and you've been working for 4 hours. So the inverse of that would be the opposite of, you know, when something bores you, when after 5 minutes you think, let me go and do some laundry. That would be more interesting than this. Yeah, that's a good one, yeah. Other ways we know stuff interests us? Where do you spend your leisure time when you're not all in the library? I mean, I assume that most of you spend most of your time in the library, but when you're not in the library, where are you? Sports fields, anyone? Any kind of sporty people, or pubs, possibly bars? Right. So when you're out doing some kind of leisure activity with your friends, and you discover, I mean, maybe I'm making assumptions, and you'll say how sad it is that when I spend my leisure time, I end up somehow talking about those topics that you end up talking about. Those surely are the things that interest you. You know, if it's Kate Middleton's latest frock, then you can probably assume that you're quite interested in Kate Middleton and her frock. If that's the way conversation goes, then these are the things that interest you. Particularly if you find yourself irritated by or pissed off by the comment of the person you're talking with who says, you know, she looks dreadful, or hasn't she put on a lot of weight this week or something, and you kind of suddenly find yourself, what an outrageous thing to say. She's still as beautiful as she ever was. So those moments when you find yourself being irritated by someone, so a bit of passion, that's a good way of knowing when you're interested in something. So emotion, if you're watching something on the TV, you know, go back to the HIV/AIDS example, if you kind of see some news report and you kind of feel your heartstrings being tugged, I mean, these are things which you're motivated by. Okay, so it is actually worth thinking about what genuinely interests you. And one of the ways kind of for homing in on dissertation projects, and lots of, I'm sure, whatever, not just development, but whatever area of research you do, your lecturers will encourage you to follow your interests. And you'll find it much easier to do research if you kind of go down the road of something you're interested in and care about. So spending time trying to work out something you find interesting. Your dissertation, your field research will be much easier if you're genuinely interested in the topic. Okay. So how, having identified our interest, can we turn it into a topic? So I told you my interests are in questions around nature, cities and politics. And the broad topics where I've done research in the last few years include Things like urban agriculture, botanic gardens, the associational life of cities, water use in cities, I've already mentioned. Cyborg urbanization is the kind of combination of people and technology in a city, how people come to depend on technology in cities. So you can see how these things have moved from very broad ideas, nature, city, politics, to something that looks like it might be the title of a book. You can imagine if you're kind of scanning along shelves of the library in the geography section, you can kind of imagine a book called Urban Agriculture, can't you? It's kind of it's a book-sized topic. You can see how there would be different case studies and different debates about whether it's useful or not, what different forms it could take. So these are what we're looking at. So grab the person next to you and in a minute write down 3 topics that you might be able to So you've taken your ingredients, your interests, and you've kind of, the first stage of the recipe, mixed them up to kind of produce these broad topics. So these are the kind of things that I said that Granny would understand. If you're having trouble with this, there are kind of various different ways of identifying the broad topics. You can start from your lectures, you can start from your studies in university, think about the things that you hear your lecturers say that irritate you, think about the things that provoke you, think about the things, the claims they make that you think that's too simplistic, or I think that might be different in some other place. What do you disagree with? Think about subheadings in textbooks that you're interested in as you're doing research for essays and things. Think about change. Change is always really useful. What changes in the law are there in the places you're interested in? What changes in policy? What changes have you seen that are taking place in your interest that could be relevant? Is there some kind of medical innovation, kind of going back to the example of HIV/AIDS? Is there some kind of innovation in funding regime? Those kind of questions, changes, are a good place to look for broad interests. The media and questions of representation are always another good place to kind of find projects. Think about the last time you got into a row with one of your friends, an argument, or one of those late night arguments about whether or not we should be giving aid to India. You know, the government's just decided to reduce its funding of aid to India. You know, you might end up in an argument for or against that policy decision, and you might think, well, where's the actual evidence? What I need here to kind of make my case, to win my side of the argument, is better evidence. So that might be the place where you find your project. So how do we turn these broad topics into narrow topics? So I've got 3 basic strategies. One, working from the bottom of these 3 bullet points, one might be about being careful to kind of get something that's practical size, that's a realistic size project. Then the one in the middle is about the parameters, the spatial and the temporal parameters of your study. And then this top one is this idea of deverbal nouns, which sounds bonkers, and I'll explain that in a second. So here are my broad topics on the left from my list: urban agriculture, botanic gardens, associational life in cities, water use in cities, cyborg urbanization. So if we look at the urban agriculture one at the top, that's my broad topic. The narrow topic would look something like the expansion of urban agriculture in Cameroon during the structural adjustment period. So if we think about this issue of parameters, clearly the spatial parameter there is in Cameroon. I'm going to try and do a study that's going to be able to make some claims about Cameroon as a whole there. And the temporal parameter is the structural adjustment period. So that's a time period. You know, it's defined in a certain way about a certain economic policy, but it's basically a time period. Or the second one, conflicts between farmers and botanists in the botanic gardens in Limbe, Cameroon, the spatial parameters from 1916 to the present day. So these narrow topics start to look like dissertation titles. So rather than kind of book titles or lecture series titles, these start to look like dissertation titles. And instantly, if you were reading these titles, you could see where and when the study is taking place. So let me talk then about this idea of deverbal nouns. So what I've highlighted here is what I mean. So taking that first one, the expansion of urban agriculture in Cameroon during the structural adjustment period, what I'm talking about is that noun, the expansion. Because what that implies is that something has happened. Urban agriculture has expanded. in this place, in this time. At the start of that time period, 30% of people used to grow crops to feed their families. At the end of that period, 80%. So something has happened. There is, therefore, a claim to be tested. And however much we might dislike kind of narrowing down the language of kind of writing research projects to questions of hypothesis and hypothesis testing, at some level that's ultimately what we're doing. We have some ideas that we go into the field with, some claims. We are testing those claims. Somebody has changed the law on education in Bangladesh. We are testing the impact of that claim. What happened when they did that? So that's what I'm trying to get at, thinking about what those claims are and thinking about what those processes are. Okay, so you listed down a second ago 2 or 3 ideas of what your broad topics. So another couple of minutes talking to your neighbours about how you might actually... Okay, so we've taken our ingredients, the interests, we've mixed them up in the mixing bowl to produce narrow topics, and now we've poured the dough into the muffin tray of life, ready to go into the oven of research or something. The cruelly tortured metaphor creeps forward. So now you've got narrow topics. You need to actually turn them into research questions. So you've got that thing that looks like a dissertation title, and you're hoping that you're going to be able to kind of find some research. And the way I do this with my colleagues who I'm working on projects with is to kind of get to this point and then to kind of try and just bombard it with questions. What do I need to know to explore that topic? Some of those questions will be, you know, who, what, when questions, the kind of pragmatic, nitty-gritty questions. So they're important, they're vital, but they're probably not going to be your research questions. They're probably going to be the questions you use in interviews or in questionnaires. They're the questions that are going to underpin your research in terms of the data collection, in terms of the gathering. So they'll be the kind of fine-grained questions. The questions we're looking for are usually the how, why questions. So you might kind of take my kind of case study, you know, like who are these urban farmers? Who's doing urban farming? What are they farming? Where are they farming? What are they growing? Are they selling it? And you might have a list at the end of the day of 60 or 70 or 80 of these questions. So I think people often ask us, how many research questions do I need? And we turn around and say, 3 or 4, maybe 5 if you're lucky. And then people think the first kind of 5 questions that come into their head, and there they are, my research questions. But you can see that if you kind of go down those very narrow questions like, who are these urban farmers? What are they growing? Those aren't really substantive questions. They aren't questions that are going to be interesting people. Why did people turn to urban farming during the structural adjustment period is a more substantive question. Why and how questions tend to be more substantive. Questions that engage with theoretical concepts, big ideas, are going to be the research questions. So you might strategically think about how you divvy up your list of 3, 4, 5 big research questions. Some might be empirical, some might be conceptual, and some will definitely, hopefully, be some of these how and why questions. If you're having trouble identifying these questions, then this matrix gives you kind of some starting points. So this is kind of a checklist for you when you've got your narrow topic at the head of the piece of paper and you're just trying to find the questions. You can think about the different component parts of the topic, the different bits. So you're thinking about urban agriculture. Well, there's the there's the crops, there's the people, there's the tools, there's the land, there's the climate, the soil, the weather. So you've got the different components that it would take to think about what growing crops in the city entails. What are the structures in the topic? You know, is urban agriculture part of a bigger story about agriculture generally in Cameroon? What's the history and geography? Is one city different from another city? One part of the city different from another part of the city? Is the way that women farm different from the way men farm? Have people been farming in this city since the year dot, or have they just started recently? How has the nature of farming changed over time? You can see how this list of questions proliferates and multiplies. So that's just a checklist to help you start developing all these different kinds of questions. So you might end up with questions like, why has urban agriculture expanded? How have the conflicts between farmers and botanists been resolved? How do ethnic associations in London contribute to Nigerian development? How has water been commodified? These are big questions that it's going to take a dissertation to answer. These are the kind of substantive, interesting questions that you hope you can write 10,000 words about rather than 50. Last step in the recipe. So the muffins have come out of the oven and are cooling on the cooling rack of destiny. So what we're trying to do here is think about, what is the point of doing this? And this is a little formula that you can build into your research proposals at the outset, thinking about the different ingredients in this recipe, in this process, and using those different ingredients to try and identify the rationale for your study. The why are you doing this? Well, obviously the reason you're doing this is part of your degree, and you have to do this, and you don't have any choice about it, and don't do your dissertation, you don't get the degree, and you don't get your job. But we're setting that aside for the moment and thinking more intellectually and more academically about the why are we doing this research. And for any project, I think you can use this sentence that I've got at the bottom. So the sentence is, I am studying X because I want to find out how or why, in order to understand how, why, what, Z. And the X, Y, and Z of that sentence are your topic, your question, and then by the time you've kind of answered this sentence, your rationale. So here's my case studies, my worked examples. I am studying urban agriculture, my broad topic, so that's kind of one of our parts of this recipe, because I want to find out why it has expanded in Cameroon in the last 10 years, my research question. So it's kind of forcing me then to say, in order to understand how natural resources become incorporated into politics. And this is where I'm trying to tie what I'm saying in part 2 of this presentation back into the first part to kind of get you to think about the middle of the wine glass and the top of the wine glass again, the narrow and the broad. So I've gone from my very narrow study of this particular topic in Cameroon to go straight back to my big interests, natural resources, politics, cities. So you kind of take those elements and the in order to bit becomes explained in those terms. I'm studying water use in Cameroon because I want to find out about how water has been commodified in order to understand the political struggles over water supply. So you articulate the reason you're doing this in the same terms that you started with. There's no point in leaving water at the bottom of the well. If you want to make the water in the well work, you have to bring the water up from the bottom of the well and spread it on the fields around so that the crops can grow. Yes, it's metaphor number 3. You can see here what I'm trying to get at is there's no point in being narrow and specific and leaving stuff down there. We want you to bring the findings of your research back to geography, back to British geography, back to your colleagues, the people who are going to market, but back to DARG as well. We want to see reports. The RGS wants to see reports of your findings because other people will want to know. And if you can make them relevant, if you can explain the rationale of your study, then hopefully other people will too. So just really quickly in the last couple of minutes, taking your narrow topics, try at this stage to see if you could articulate it in the form of this sentence. I'm studying X because I want to find out Y in order to understand Z. See if you can phrase your topic in those terms, and that's the last point I want to make.